Hey, everybody. Thanks for hopefully joining in with us today. Terry Francis and I are going to take a little time here at 11 o'clock to talk about the work of an evangelist. He'll be joining us hopefully in just a few moments. We're going to be talking today about the subject of teaching, specifically looking into the interconnection between the work that a preacher does in teaching God's Word and try to break down in an overview sense a couple of key issues that are of significant and significant importance that all of us probably would be well equipped to understand better. And so we've just got 5 key ideas. They're listed for you in the topic information that we're going to slowly unpackage. And as we do that, we're hopefully laying some seeds for some upcoming conversations, because this is really not a subject that we can cover in just one particular episode. Just breaking it down, we're going to talk about this classic model of who, what, where, when, and why as it relates to the teaching activities of an evangelist. As a backdrop, we've got a passage from the text of James in chapter 3 and verse 1. It's an admonition that states, "Not many of you should become teachers, my brothers, for you know that we who teach will be judged with greater strictness." And so there's some correlation between the standard that God has, the responsibility of entrusting it to, as Paul might include this idea of faithful men also, and engaging in the sharing of that message with others. I'll tell you on a very simple level, it's one of the things that, at least from my perspective, isn't necessarily on the table as much as it should be in the equipping of young men to preach. And here's what I mean by that. There are probably a number of motivational factors that draw a person into the work of an evangelist. But for our purposes today, I want to categorize just 3 of what I've seen as the major ones. One of them comes from a very inward, great spiritual desire, is the concept of a soul winner. There's a lot of folks who are really effective at showing someone the cross of Christ. And with that effectiveness and with that connection, they become very good at drawing someone into a consideration of the cross. And so for some folks who preach, it's very likely they had some great success before they took up that work. And so that draws them into preaching. I think there's another group, and there's some positive and negatives to this aspect, that see the value of the public side of preaching, a sense of adulation, a sense of accomplishment, a sense of connectedness to the public work of a congregation, and they thoroughly enjoy the public edge of preaching the gospel. And so that draws them into the work of an evangelist, the work of a teacher, the work of a gospel-connected person to a congregational's work. And so congregation's work. And so that draws them in. And so that's the 2 edges, and probably in many ways represent the 2 largest pools of interest for young men that are drawn into the work of, into gospel work broadly. There's a narrow group that are those that are drawn in because they simply love to teach the word. It's not so much about the results. It's not so much about the perception of things. They love the process of teaching. That's the smallest segment in some ways. With that there, and by the way, Terry Francis is going to join us at some point. He's probably struggling to figure out which buttons to push, and he doesn't have the same familiar support that Edwin Crozier had to figure out whatever technical problems he's got going on. So hopefully he'll figure that out soon enough and be able to jump into this broadcast. But with what we've got here, that smallest segment, the teacher segment, in there, we don't do a great job of equipping young men in particular in advance of them moving into this role in the best ways that we could. We just kind of make some broad assumptions of, well, they know it well enough, or they've seen it done before, or any of those other factors. But what Terry and I are going to try to accomplish is at least lay out some concepts that can be used as tools to improve early on in the process of teaching the gospel in your relationship to the congregation that you're part of, or just in a very broad sense in any setting of Bible teaching. And so I kind of hope that this segment here will be of value to everybody and not just in that narrow niche of those who preach and those who teach. It looks like Terry is.
Hey, there he is. He's found out how to push the buttons.
The notification didn't come up. I was waiting and waiting and waiting, and there was nothing. And then I saw your live for 4 minutes. I'm like, how did that happen?
Yeah.
It's crazy.
You didn't have a child there to guide you through like other evangelists we know of that seem to have this in-house technical support team to solve all their issues.
Well, I was thinking you're trying to hide out from your kids, and you successfully hid from me as well. So that was pretty powerful, pretty amazing.
Yeah, we're on spring break this week, and so the kids are a little curious and want to see where I might be doing this broadcast. And so you might notice I'm in an automobile in a semi-undisclosed location. Hopefully I'm far enough away from them that it'll take them a certain amount of time to get here, and we'll be done before they find me.
Is the car on, or are you roasting, and are we going to see you sweat?
We haven't hit those temperatures yet, so I won't die. But I might, hey, I could use a little weight, so I'm not going to fight it.
Today on Do the Work, we're going to talk about teaching while Phil's in the sauna. So join us all.
Yeah, that's going to be 0 viewers.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so I already kind of gave us a good overview of what we're getting into in the sense of the big picture. Talked about the draws that folks sometimes have to get them into the work of preaching. And so let's dig right in now into our 5 items. And our first one for us is if you're going to be engaged in teaching the gospel, you really need to take some time to better appreciate or understand your audience. And I'm going to talk about one of my experiences that kind of connected this a little bit. And Terry's got some great insight here too. I think he's done a great job teaching in both the congregational context and outside of his congregational relationship. As a new evangelist, I moved to work with a congregation full of some tremendously amazing people. And in no time at all, like within a week of me getting there, the question was, all right, what's going to be going on in our adult Bible class? Phillip, what are we going to be studying? And I'm like, how about Isaiah? And the only reason I said Isaiah is I had just, bought a new commentary about Isaiah, and I was super excited. And so you combine my level of excitement with also what I knew. And I had just finished being a college student. So all my classes that I was familiar with were really college level concepts. Reading lists, 7 books for every class, syllabuses, all those things have great value. And I've got a congregation of folks who span the gamut from folks who are in their retirement phase of life, moms, dads, everything. And so I'm handing out a syllabus with a reading list with book suggestions, and let's go to work. Let me tell you how quickly that failed. Like it was a train wreck by day 3. And I'll tell you that was a group problem. Yes, part of that was me, but that was also my inexperience. But I think that's not the only time that's ever happened to young preachers. Terry?
Well, I think it's funny that you went in with a reading list and an adult Bible class, and you found out by week 2 that 85% of the adults didn't do their lesson, let alone are they going to read 8 extra books. And that's just part of understanding your audience. But this changes on every level of teaching, how you teach and what you teach based on who your audience is. In the area of one-on-one evangelism, one of our downfalls, I think, sometimes is we think there's only one way to teach somebody, but the person you're teaching should dictate what you teach. Yeah. When you study with somebody who has no background versus somebody who is maybe an active member at a denomination, that changes your approach drastically in what you study with them. So you have to understand your audience. Same thing, let me say this to guys, and especially men teacher, David Banning says this a lot. We go into the high school class, for example, we teach them like the adults, and which means we lecture them. And the reality is we shouldn't be lecturing the adults either, but we should surely not be lecturing our high school students.
Yeah.
And part of that comes down to knowing audiences and attention spans and interest level and knowledge level. There's a lot that goes into understanding who your audience is.
Yeah, and the evangelist needs to learn to be accommodatively flexible. And here's a couple of key areas. Number 1 is in your Bible translation. I've typically now, for most of my personal Bible studies, will use the ESV because it's a nice middle ground. even though often I primarily study on my own out of the New American Standard or some of the original manuscripts. I struggle through those from time to time on a personal level. But that may not be the best option for someone. If someone has only read the original King James all their life, then I'll pull out my hardbound edition and do my best. Because I need to connect them with God, not with my preferences, and not with my personality. I need to show them the cross. And some of that is learning to know that audience. Age comes into those factors. Their background comes into it as well. And in all of those areas, it changes dynamically over the course of a relationship. The first time you teach an adult class is different than the next time you teach that same adult class a year later. Different people, sometimes they've grown, sometimes you've grown. And so unlike certain things, I have a friend of mine who teaches history, and he's like, history hasn't changed. So his charts he used 5 years ago, they have a lot of similarities to the charts he's using today.
Yeah.
I can't do that, and we can't do that evangelistically on many levels. Material hasn't changed, but the people who are receiving it and the teacher have changed quite a bit.
Absolutely. Sunday morning I taught a class on evidences to a group of adults, and Sunday night I was at a work release facility associated with a jail teaching from John 12. And not only was the subject different, but the way I teach those two different groups is vastly different. And when I go into the jail, I teach those guys different. And there's a whole lot that goes into knowing who your audience is. And that you cannot be effective if you think there's only one way to teach every group of people.
Yeah. And that kind of connects us to our what side. That's kind of understanding our aim or our immediate short-term goals for a Bible study. Sometimes I think we get this idea that, we're going to accomplish 8 or 9 different things in a Bible study or whatever, or we don't even make goals. You've got to have some sense of direction with what you're laying down. We can understand it in a personal conversation about who is God and the need to obey him. All right. But in an adult Bible class, if you just say, we're going to teach Ephesians, okay. How are you going to teach Ephesians? What are you wanting folks to understand from that particular book? What do they already know? Is this their 7th time through it in an expository way? Is there a better way or a better idea that you can bring to the table? And not having that conversation ahead of time might be one of the reasons, and I don't know if you've experienced this. I know I visited places before where the first time I visited them, they're in Matthew chapter 2, and then a couple of years come by and they're Matthew chapter 5. And you, before anyone thinks, oh, that's just a preacher story, you're using like this hyperbole or something, or really going out of the world.
No,
it's not.
My first work, we had a member that was teaching through Acts, and we finally completed it almost 4 years later. And I think everybody's found themselves in that situation at some point. And one of the reasons is and what happens, let me say this, sometimes there's this notion, this quaint notion of, let's just go in there and go verse by verse and get done what we get done. And so I got to tell you, one of the aims needs to be, this is how much I'm going to cover today.
Yeah.
And that's got to be determined, like you said, that's really even the first lesson, understanding your time limits. If you're on a quarter system or a trimester system, or if they give you 6 months, you need to know how long you have. I'm a big fan of writing my own material for this reason. I know I just made every bookstore owner and publisher cringe, but solely because I then know for every lesson what my goal is, what my aim is for that lesson, better than if I borrow somebody else's material.
Yeah, one of the things I do to help me accomplish that is I lay out a structure for the classes that include gospel meetings, that include different evangelistic works the congregation might have going on, knowing ahead of time vacation schedules and some of those things, so I know my blocks of time. And then I've outlined the chapters, the books we're going to be going through, and that outline serves as my aim structure that says we're going to study Numbers chapter 13, which is giants of grapes, in essence, is the context. And so that I know that I'm going to take maybe 2 class periods for that idea, that concept, and really kind of incorporate it into the process. And so you got to understand those goals. I want to include one other, component. your aims have to fit into the bigger structure of the congregation's work.
Yeah.
And have to have a place there. You don't need to have repetition of ideas all the time, although sometimes that's good, but they should fit in. And whether you're teaching a one-off class or in a system of classes, bring them together in a way that there's value in the big picture, even if you're not the one doing all the parts of the puzzle. And so I'd really encourage folks, just pause and think about, okay, what are my goals? And if you don't have goals, take some time to refine them. And if you have trouble putting them together, talk to the congregation in the appropriate ways. Talk to those elders that are shepherding your soul. Work with them. Talk to the deacons. Talk to who used to teach these classes. Figure out what's been done, successes and failures, and own your part of it. If you own a failure, own it. That's your failure.
Part of that
success, share it.
Part of that you just said is interesting, and this is a whole other video at some point, is that also means that as a congregation, you actually have to have a big picture plan.
Yeah.
In regards to classes, let me say, I think into elders and leadership, you need to have a long-term plan about what you're going to study. I've been in so many places where we get to the end of the quarter and it's like, oh, what are we going to study next? And sometimes we just let the teacher pick, which, by the way, is how you end up studying Acts every other 6 months. And so there needs to be a long-range plan. You need to have a plan that includes both the textual and the topical. You need to know where you're going. You need to cover the Old Testament and the New Testament. You need to cover the subjects nobody wants to teach. I mean, we've all been at places or seen places that they haven't studied Revelation in 20 years because nobody wants to teach it. So we just skip over it. You can't do that. You got to have a long-range picture in all, and because as a teacher, you can't fit into that if you don't have that.
Right, and it really connects to your methodology. There's a couple of conceptual tools that are used in life that are, this method works. I'll throw one of the ones that I've encountered in a lot of places, that it's a method that functions well. And that is, on a practical level, you explain something, and then you demonstrate it, and you guide someone doing that same thing, and then you give them a chance to do it themselves, the old EDGE method of instruction. In congregational context, we do basically that same thing too. We lay out, here's what we're going to be doing. And so now that we're in these structured classes, and you already talked a little bit about this, the method for teaching adult class is different than the method for teaching little kids, toddlers, and so on. That has to do with like our where side of thing. Where the class takes place sometimes heavily dictates how you're going to teach that material. It just simply does. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it in that sense. Prison versus congregational context, methods change a lot there. So don't be wedded to one method just because that's the only method that you know. Not every problem in teaching is a nail that's solved by your hammer. And so take the time to learn some additional standards, some new expectations, some new methodologies to explain, to engage, to teach, like digital mediums. And Terry writes his own material. I write my own material too. Mainly it's instructional side to generate conversation. I found that my goal is to get people to have a conversation in the class. Mm-hmm. And I want to bring information that makes that conversation richer. So my primary homework, if you will, for folks is always, I want you reading what we're studying. We're going to be reading out of this section of the Bible. You should be studying that, reading it. Let me give one more tip right here. There's a study tool that I think is awesome. It's called the Squirrel. I don't know if Terry saw me put it up there. It's SQRL. If you're given an assignment to study something, the first thing you do is you survey what you're looking at. So if it's Colossians, you survey Colossians, you remind yourself what's in there. And then you're going to take some time to, do I have questions? I've surveyed it. What do I not know? And then I'm going to read/review the actual book I'm getting prepared to be a student in. And then I go to the lecture. I go to the class. I go to the time to listen. And so I've taken my time while being a squirrel in advance of trying to learn. And I do that as a teacher. That's the same thing I do when I get ready for a class is I put out my squirrel. Mm-hmm. I survey. What are my questions? Let's do some research. Let's do some reading. Let's do some reconsideration. And let's get up there and start getting to work so I can learn.
Yeah, let me say two things. First off, age and attention ability has a lot to do with what your methodology is, and it's something I think we ignore. That goes into play, especially in the differences between the high school and the adult class. So just a quick mathematical formula for that. This works for kids too. Take the average age of your class, divide it into the number of minutes you have in your class. That's how many activities you have to have. So if you're meeting age, if you got a 45-minute period, you have 5-year-olds. That's 9 different activities, if my math is correct there. It is. And for adults, so the average age a lot of times is 40 into 45 minutes, and that's why we tend to go to lectures, because adults can pay that attention that long. Think about high school class. 15 years old is your average age. You have 3 different activities in one class, and that's where we fail. And the second thing along with that is those kind of things. I think one of the things that the church as a whole has not done a good job in the area of methodology of teaching is we've not taught people how to teach. And I think one of the things we need to work on, not only as preachers, learning how to teach ourselves better, but also then teaching our teachers how to teach the classes that are appropriate, bringing people in. I know that I've had David Banning come in, I think 3 times at different groups I've been with. Ken Welliver's come in and done that for us. We've had some of the ladies that were associated with other material come in, like Darla Walker. And churches ought to be active in teaching their teachers how to teach and sharing with them better methodology so they can understand how to apply that to the different situations. Also applies to evangelism. We need to teach people how to do evangelism and the various ways to do that. So when they get in one-on-one teaching, they have different methodology as well that's available to them.
Right.
So one of the things that I think is important is sometimes guys, to the common teacher, doesn't understand any other method than what he has because he's never been exposed to it. So we have to work at doing that to help our people be able to teach, and ourselves along those lines.
Yeah. And another concept in the win side of things is understanding the intersection between milk and meat.
Yeah.
And I'm using the biblical analogies and the biblical concepts there of milk and meat. And I want to dissect something really important. Just because you take some meat and you thoroughly water it down doesn't make it milk. And
Right.
just because you've got milk and then you try to throw in a slab of steak in the middle of it doesn't mean it's suitable for somebody else. A lot of the instructional material that is produced for, say, like vacation Bible schools is very watered down. There's reasons for that because of its focus, its intent, but it often covers up big chunks of the real story of God. Now, the important thing for us to understand is that many of the Christians we're going to interact with, those stories they heard in vacation Bible school that were watered down are now functionally changing their understanding of the big picture of the story as adults. And I always use this basic illustration. Close your eyes and picture the ark. Did you have giraffes sticking out the top of it? Or did you have a picture that kind of matches the Bible story of the ark that Noah built? And for most folks, the first image that comes up is, well, there's some giraffes sitting up, and it's this little cute little boat.
And 2 male lions, which is the most interesting part of those pictures.
Many of them. There's many facets of that. But
Yeah.
that is not meat or milk. That's watered down. That's soft soap when it should be, a firm washing. So I would say that that's the first thing we need to understand, that that's not meat or milk. But there's a time when milk is necessary. And there's, as God says, a time when we should be transitioning to meat in our Bible study. So Terry, if you were going to define it in simple terms, what's your dissection point between moving from milk to moving to meat? And I'm not saying there's a day that it happens where you're just like, okay, all this now is now meat stuff. But how would you work that transition mentally?
So let me say, first of all, that it may be easier to know what it's not. I think it's easier to find what it is not than what it is. Let me give an example of that. Just because you have a cross-reference Bible and you can tie 2 passages together does not mean that you've introduced meat to the Bible class. Or just because you have a concordance or you have software that may give you every time that this one phrase is used doesn't mean that that's meat. I think that's one of the things that we're going to be careful about. Okay.
Yeah.
meat is when you consider all those things in their context, and you actually, if they are associated, meat is being able to bring that together with all of the different parts of how that goes together, showing the harmony of Scripture. I think that's where we get to more the meaty things, is those kind of things. Also, the depth of application, I think, is a big part of meat, and making sure that it applies to somebody's life in a way that's practical and useful.
Yeah.
Let me also say this. In most of your Bible classes, if you're an adult Bible class teacher, you are going to have to offer both.
Yeah.
In most cases, you're going to have to offer some milk and some meat. And what that means is there's going to be some things that are above some people's heads and some things that are below their necks. And if you're going to be a successful teacher, you kind of have to do both those things. So I have to have somebody come out and say, well, I already knew that, but now this helped me quite a bit. Then you've been kind of successful, I think, in those regards.
Right. And just as a feedback point, you're never going to get someone who comes to you and has feedback that hits the spectrum of your sermon. They're going to be able to give feedback on the sections that hit them or missed them. Like, I didn't understand that. Why did you do that? Or this really hit me, and it hit them positively or negatively. So learn to correlate that all together and draw it all together when you're listening to feedback to do better the next time.
Yeah.
Because there's always that need to improve. Hal had a great question. I want to jump back just a second to talk one detail about that. Yes, sometimes you get pushback in regards to instructor training, teacher training. A great thing you can do is to third party it, have it not be you.
Right.
Bring in someone else who has expertise in that area so that you get to get better, because you're bringing it in not just for everybody else. You bring that expert in, you get better too. And so that's a benefit to you. That's like the second layer of it. But then that third party expertise is viewed differently, because you can say, I need this too. And you do. We all do. It doesn't mean you can't do teacher training events yourself in the congregation, but bringing that third person in at least helps with part of that pushback. Now, you may not get buy-in, and sometimes you don't. One of the things I think is important, though, when you move out of the congregational context, every other industry I know where people want to do well at, they're constantly having and going and participating in training events, spring training, baseball, preseason, all that. Businesses do it all the time. Congregations need to be better at that.
We talked
Christians
about
need to be better at that.
We talked about professional development with preachers earlier on in our work here on this page, and the same kind of idea for teachers. By the way, there's some videos out there. I know David Banning has some of his stuff in video format online that you can actually, in the past, I've actually taken some of those, and they're in short clips, and sent them to our teachers and said, hey, here's something you may consider and look at. And it's a lot less offensive than maybe you going and say, hey, I need to talk to you about this. So just think about that. There's a lot of things there. We need to wrap it up. So let's talk about the why, Phil. I'll just introduce this real quick, that we need to understand what the mission is overall of our teaching. And one of the things I think that we understand our mission is, I think about just Matthew 28, 18 through 20, where the mission there, the Great Commission, is to make disciples. And that's what I think we think sometimes our mission is to baptize people, but our mission is to make disciples. You do that by baptizing them and teaching them to observe all the things that Jesus has said. And so in our Bible classes, our core mission is still the same: make disciples. Or in the case of like an adult class, make better disciples, help people in their walk as discipleship. And I think that changes what you do. When you're going through Isaiah, you may get sidetracked, or even like Ezekiel, you may get sidetracked, and I do this sometimes in some neat nuances of the prophecies and the history. But at the end of the day, if you share all those neat nuances and all those kind of things, or maybe maybe you get into this one subject of, hey, is this really what is going on here? Or maybe you introduce some kind of odd concept you read about somewhere you thought was particularly interesting. At the end of the day, if you're not helping somebody being a disciple, then you've not reached your mission purpose. And so what you have to do in all those things is keep it mission-based. What am I going to teach in this class to make this person a better disciple at the end of class? That's got to be your main focus.
Yeah, I think it's a really simple concept that we always need to keep on the top of the list, but we allow to sink down. Mission focus is essential in anything that we really want to be excellent at. And if my mission is to make disciples, and I can ask the question, does this help me make disciples or make disciples stronger? And keep going back to that core mission goal, that mission expectation, then I can refine, am I staying with that? As an example, it talks about little neat prophecies. Here's a fact. In Israel, archaeologically speaking, there's not a lot of pig bones, right? I mean, that makes sense, doesn't it? But also, in the New Testament, in the Gospels, there's lots of story about pigs. Does that mean that now is going to be an entire class and we're going to spend 3 hours talking about pig husbandry in a Bible study? No. That being said, there's value
Pigs of
to
the
that
Bible.
Pigs of the Bible. Bible swine, brethren. Stand and sing.
Yeah.
So those are concepts that are all kind of tying together about mission focus. There's a place for that. It comes in the substance side of taking a message and making it more substantial, more like a full meal. And so with that in mind, we can go say, now this accomplishes our mission, and keep that in focus. Keep that, that why we're doing this and the big picture of things. And all of these things are designed to glorify God. We're breaking down the mechanics of it. Brendan asked a quick question. I want to make sure we catch it while we're on air as recommendations for, teacher training settings. Terry, you've got a few things, and I'll finish up our video.
Well, at my last work, I was actually over the teaching program for non-adult Bible classes. And one of the things we would always do is we'd always set up an arrangement for teaching training to go on. And so we always, by the way, I think a good general rule for liability reasons, by the way, is to team teach all your classes. That's maybe a whole other thing. But we would often have a third teacher in those situations who had never taught before. They would sit, they would observe, they would then assist at some point. By the end of the quarter, the goal was for them to actually be teaching a full lesson and do all the planning and the preparation under the mentorship of the two existing established teachers. And I've done that with an adult Bible class too, where I will bring in another teacher. Usually I don't have a co-teacher in an adult Bible class. I just do all the teaching myself. But when I am out of town, I'll get a younger guy to teach, but I will give him the notes and we will talk about what he's going to do. And I will assist him and mentor him in that. And then afterwards, we'll talk about how that went. I'm a big believer in training people how to teach and putting them eventually in that role.
Right. And expanding that idea, you can do it in-house that way. You're reaching out to guys like David Banning. He's got a lot of success that way. I'll also add that I think Terry would do a good job on the structural side of things and helping someone, figure out how to accomplish a teacher training event in a local context. A lot of gospel teachers are really effective individuals, and actually that's their strong suit. Most of the guys that you don't see on YouTube, you don't see in gospel meetings, are often really effective teachers because their skills are in that niche, so they don't do other things. And so we'll try to take some time also to link some things in the notes. Terry can see those questions and combine some things there. We really appreciate everyone joining us today. We know that your time is valuable, and spending it on staring at us knuckleheads is a serious investment, and it probably means you care more about what we're talking about than us. And we appreciate that. One thing I would love for everybody to do, if this is a work or an activity that would benefit somebody, share these videos with people you care about. If you care about the subject of teaching the gospel, if you care about the work that preachers do, then share the page, share these videos. If you have questions, reach out to either of us. We do try to incorporate some of those things into our upcoming discussions. Know this, you'll never see us doing these broadcasts while we're driving the services on Sunday morning. We're trying to prepare to worship on those days, and our hearts are really focused on engaging in our worship with our brethren at those times.
One of us has never done that. I'm just going to say, one of us has avoided that temptation, and one has a couple of nostril shot videos out there if you want to go research it. I'm not going to say which one it is, but just saying.
Hey, my eyes were on the road and I was safe.
Yeah.
Have a great day, everybody.
Notice who has a car set up. Wonder why that is. Y'all have a great day.
Bye-bye.